We got the signal for recording and translation. Okay. Welcome to Revisioning the Role of the Humanities Center. Again, I'm Stephen Bass, Director of the Townsend Center for the Humanities. This panel has been convened to kind of discuss a particular project, that was funded by the Mellon Foundation at Brandeis on reimagining the Humanities Center, exploring the ways to make humanities centers more sort of structurally significant parts of the university. So we'll talk a bit about the Humanities Center in the structurally insignificant sense and structurally significant sense over the course of the panel. The principal investigator for that project is Ulka Anjaria, professor of English and director of the Mandel Center for the Humanities at Brandeis University. And also a participant in the workshop was Erika George, former director of the Tanner Center. Oh, okay, director of the Tanner Center. Sorry, for the Humanities at Utah. And we've also invited Ian Baucom and Rosinka Chaudhuri, who are not parts of the working group, to be on this panel and to sort of address some of the broader questions that were raised both by the project and that we want to sort of discuss on this panel. So we were going to begin with Ulka, who was going to take a minute to kind of explain the objectives of the project and the sense of Mellon's particular interest in the project.
Thank you, and thanks all for coming. So yeah, I'm just going to speak briefly about the project, which was called Re-envisioning the Role of the Humanities Center for the 21st Century University, and it was funded by an officer's grant from the Mellon Foundation. And as Stephen said, the intent of the project was to see how humanities centers could be better positioned within universities to advance, of course, the importance of the humanities, but also questions of social justice and community engagement. And these are questions that many of you are likely already thinking about. So the panel, this project was an attempt to just bring together 10 directors of humanities centers from different types of institutions around the United States and have a conversation, bringing together thoughts that many were having. And so I'm thankful to all the participants, many of whom are in the room, including Erika. So there are three parts to our discussion over the course of the year. One is to assess the lay of the land in terms of currently existing humanities centers around the country, focusing especially on their institutional placement within the university and on the kinds of projects and questions they're currently engaged with, especially as they relate to public-facing and socially engaged humanistic inquiry. Second, to consider concrete ways in which humanities centers might shift to explicitly foreground questions of social justice, what kinds of projects humanities centers can take on individually and collaboratively, and three, how building on this kind of work, humanities centers might become what we're calling essential infrastructure to the university of the future. The goal of the project is to produce a document that outlines a vision for where we are and where we might go that might be useful for current directors, future directors, and hopefully for CHCI as well. So I'm just going to give you a sense of some of the questions that came up in our discussions as a group, and then we'll have some time for audience Q&A afterwards. So there are definitely there's a range in the kinds of institutions, obviously, and a range in how well funded humanities centers are within them. And we need to be cognizant of these differences even while trying to think across institutions. On top of that, whether or not a humanities center has a social justice imperative is often dependent on who the director is. So there's quite a bit of fluctuation even within individual centers on what their vision and mission are. What structures might be put in place to allow for more of a continuity of vision beyond individual directors? What kind of leadership training could take place across institutions, for instance, sponsored by CHCI, as in the great discussion we just had? What kinds of additional mentorship structures could exist within, for instance, CHCI, to channel the knowledge that many of us have in this room and help foster new generations of leaders, and to help perpetuate social justice imperatives beyond individual directors? What changes could humanities centers help facilitate within universities? We realize that much of this is dependent on the perception of the role of the Humanities Center within different campuses, and that does vary widely. In some places, Humanities Centers directors sit on humanities councils or on the provost council, but in others, they're completely apart from the running of the university. There's also a tension, or at least a perceived tension, between humanities centers as having a role in university administration and humanities centers being kind of a crucible for ideas, somewhat free of institutional politics. So how can we make more humanities centrals more central to university administration while continuing to retain that sense of intellectual freedom and the experimental ethos that many of us value? Lots of humanities centers, as we've already discussed this morning, are doing a whole range of community-engaged work as well as student and faculty-facing initiatives. And I've learned so much from my collaborators on what kind of programming is possible. Speaker series for audiences including and beyond the university, public humanities fellowships that work with partner organizations, difficulty dialogues that engage with difficult topics in community conversations, concerts, oral history, and mapping projects, prison education initiatives, events like art festivals and Humanities Week, and workshops and sessions by and for K through 12 educators, among others. But how do we transform these from one-off or institutionally specific programming to a larger vision for the university of the 21st century? How do we start thinking about institutional collaborations, not only among neighboring institutions, but across the country and even the world, while still taking into account the fact that institutions are differently structured and differently resourced? How do we start thinking bigger to push the conversations in and around the university towards a more national stage? Especially in the current political climate in the United States, with the criminalization of teaching critical race theory under the pretense of free speech and religious freedom, the attacks on LGBTQ plus individuals and topics, and the attacks on humanities and liberal arts education at large. How do we build on the work that individual centers are doing to think bigger about the potential role of humanistic inquiry in the larger national scale? Part of this means expanding our idea of humanities beyond individual disciplines, or even beyond the disciplines that traditionally constitute the humanities. Thinking about bringing back the humanity in humanities, and also thinking about being able to translate our ideas beyond our narrow audiences. And that I don't even just mean our disciplines, but even universities at large. And actively demonstrating why the work we do matters. There's also the question of how to document this kind of work, which often doesn't fall into the kinds of scholarly outputs our universities encourage. Community-engaged work, and even in many humanities departments, collaborative work, rarely counts in terms of institutional structures of tenure and promotion, especially in the United States and elsewhere as well. Can we make one set of changes without somehow addressing the other, without having parallel conversations about what counts as scholarship and what work gets rewarded? I'll say in closing that the conversation we had was, for the sake of this grant, limited to a small number of US institutions with humanities centers. That limited the ambit of this discussion, but it shouldn't limit the thinking about pathways for the future. So, for instance, at our second meeting, we heard from a scholar at Morehouse College on a great project on movement, memory, and justice that engages the Atlanta community to think about how to respond to and heal from the murders of Black men by police in the United States. But Morehouse actually doesn't have a humanities center. They did this in collaboration with a number of historically Black colleges and universities in Atlanta, such as Spelman and Clark. So we don't want to kind of fetishize the humanities center as the only place this work can be conceived, as Stephen has just said. We want to think beyond humanities centers to humanists, which is a much larger number of potential collaborators. Indeed, as many of you well know, the very idea of the Humanities Center, as I've been discussing it here, is very US-centric, as research centers in the rest of the world aren't always affiliated with universities. So in fact, many of you in non-US centers are already, by necessity, engaging with big questions in ways that I think we've actually come to later in the US. So as we think of this moving forward, not just as the limited project that we engaged in, I imagine there are very fruitful dialogues across national lines about the future directions that humanities centers and humanistic inquiry can take, as well as CHCI's role in enabling those dialogues. And I'm very glad to be here to take part in these discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ulka. Erika, I was wondering if you could give us a sense of the value of the both in-person and virtual meetings of the working group over the past year.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Ulka. Thank you to the Mellon Foundation for funding these conversations. I'm going to speak from the perspective of a participant, really, truly the brains behind this organizing this was putting together the people that were brought into the room virtually and in person. We were talking earlier today about how many times we met, and 2 doesn't seem appropriate. We met virtually once in the fall semester and in person over the course of 2 days in the spring semester, but really what was happening was throughout the year an asynchronous connection across our centers and continuing a conversation that was ongoing, expanding beyond the framing questions of where we were positioned, but where we potentially could position ourselves and how to have engagements with our campuses and communities about the role of the work that we do. So to the question of process and participation, we started framing questions by having a spreadsheet of what we were challenged by or struggling with, what were successes, what were victories, what were obstacles. So in even crafting questions, we collaborated to come up with what the issues were. And then by the time we met online, which happened in the fall of 2022, we'd already had a sense of what our challenges were, but we didn't fully appreciate how different our contexts were. So this assemblage included community college centers. It included public universities, private universities, HBCUs, predominantly Hispanic-serving institutions, so that there was such a wide variety of institutions doing similar things, but in different ways and in different contexts with comparative constraints and space to operate was also significant and important. The virtual meeting was sharing conversations about the types of questions that aligned with what Mellon had set out as important principles and visions as they are moving towards thinking about how we make a more inclusive future. So thinking about the ways in which we as leaders could be part of elevating knowledge that informs a more complete and accurate narrative of the human experience, generally and broadly, and laying a foundation for a more just and equitable future. So this normative overlay of what the purpose of our institutions could be doing, accelerating and responding to the demographic change in the United States. This was a US-centric conversation primarily, but our institutions are under pressure to be responsive to the changes in our society and the changing demographics of our population, and to be a place where people can come, or perhaps we need to go to the places where people are. And then finally, creating broader and equitable access to higher learning educational opportunities. So with these kinds of priorities in mind, we set about putting together our virtual conversation to craft questions that would enable us to more in-depth experience of engaging with one another in person. We met in Georgia, at Georgia State, so we were grateful for Nicholas Allen hosting us there. And we had opportunity to exchange ideas and answer these framing questions. Ones that were particularly salient and the kinds of answers that got me thinking were who are our intended audiences for our work, and how do we balance the needs of our students, the faculty, the larger community, and intercampus exchange with local off-campus communities? How do we foster cultures of public engagement and collaborative practice as exposed to monastery-like scholarly exclusion or extractive relationships with communities that we are engaged with? And then how do we sustain? And sustainability was truly a central part of this conversation. Directors come and go, institutions last a long time and are slow to shift and move and reimagine themselves. So ways to build sustainable relationships beyond the individual personalities of directors or persons and fostering a collective vision of leadership. So I know that our colleague Teresa is thinking a lot about leadership, but what is it to lead and be a leader, and how do we do that more collectively so that we have some sustainability across change and across time? It made us, we were coming out of pandemic, so it was wonderful to be with colleagues in person. I think that was critically important, and it helped to sustain this ongoing asynchronous series of communications that we continue to have. So to be in the space of the center that hosted us, seeing how the physical space is laid out in a place was also enriching. I think what I benefited most from was learning from the other center directors and really challenging one another to think about the praxis of what we do, not just the priorities that we state around social justice, but how are we doing this work? How are our colleagues on campus doing this work? And our colleague from Morehouse was especially illuminating because she had projects that she simply let students run. And students will run in different directions, and they were at the time concerned about Cop City in Atlanta and found ways to protest with art and through song and through movement and really embodying justice in place and in context. And I think her faculty learned a great deal from that experience. So being able to be generative and explorative and enjoy exploring is something that I think we would benefit from sustaining in our roles. I am not in a center that reports directly to an SVP for research. Our Humanities Center is in the College of Humanities, so it's not at a level within the structure or hierarchy of influence within the university. And the flip side of that is we do have room to experiment and to engage in different ways. So as different center directors are navigating that, being together in person, having a process that we came up with question informing instruments together, and then we're able to share our ideas was extraordinary, and thank you for organizing that.
So one of the interesting things for me about this project is its initial framing and the sense of the Humanities Center going into the project, the sense that there in some ways two kinds of humanities centers, like a kind of cloistered sense of the Humanities Center, a space of apartness, I think is how you described it, sort of policing of what counts as humanities work, and then a sort of sense of the Humanities Center as a space for the public humanities, and the project, wanting the project to kind of move beyond that, like, bifurcated sense. Stephen being Stephen, I, of course, like, gave the panel a homework assignment, and I asked them, in that sense of that, that bifurcated sense of the Humanities Center, I had them contemplate a dilemma that Terry Eagleton articulated quite eloquently about criticism. He sort of said, and this is about the cloistered versus the public sense of criticism. He sort of says, either criticism strives to justify itself at the bar of public opinion by maintaining a general humanistic responsibility for the culture as a whole, the amateurism of which will prove increasingly incapacitating as bourgeois society develops, or it converts itself into a space of technological expertise, thereby establishing its professional legitimacy at the cost of renouncing any wider social relevance. So I wanted the panelists to kind of respond to that dilemma in the frame of this project. So Ian, I wondered if you could respond to this quote, this dilemma, from the perspective of CHCI and its history, how the organization has changed, specifically in how the organization has evolved in terms of its sense of the structure and form of the Humanities Center.
Happy to do that. First of all, it's great to be here with all of you. So Stephen being Stephen, and I'm just getting to know Stephen, and it's an absolute delight, but apparently part of Stephen being Stephen is that he gives you a homework assignment the evening before. So, but it was a great assignment. We sort of rehearsed this via Zoom, and this is like one of the differences between doing things via Zoom and then in person. So yesterday, as we were gathering for the amazing talk that Veronica Gago gave us, and then the reception, we all got an email saying, hey, would you reflect on this Terry Eagleton quote? But I think it's incredibly apropos, and sort of two things. One is the model that it establishes between what you might think of as perhaps a kind of a still residually Kantian version of the cloistered humanities, right? The Humanities Center as a space that is insistent upon the freedom and the autonomy of humanistic thought. And then a different sort of version of the Humanities Center where the role of the Humanities Center and the work of the university are articulated as having responsibility for political and social and public engagement. The other thing that is in the quote is this distinction or polarity between amateurism and professionalism or expertise. And when I think about the amateur, I don't think of it dismissively. I think about it amateur from amare, to love. And that part of what draws us to this work is a certain kind of a love for it. And then the other is, how do you combine that sense of a kind of a love or a passion for what we do with professional expertise within the life of the university. So my brief take is that I think all of those things are there within the history of CHCI. I might think of our history perhaps more as a movement from the certain kind of the passion for the field, the engagement with the question of how universities articulate their purpose in relationship to the question of global grand challenges. And so I want to briefly sketch 4 quick stages in how I think CHCI as an organization over the last 40 years or so has engaged that, and I just have a little sort of trope for each of them. So the 4 stages are the study, the lab, the global commons, and the core. So I think in its earliest phases, the CHCI was a consortium that really thought about humanities centers as broadly entities that were modeled on the European form of the Institute for Advanced Study, and within the US, the form that was established by the creation in the 1970s of the National Humanities Center. And there the form was, I think, the form of the study and the seminar, right? The role of the Humanities Center was to provide a place for scholars to have a study, right? To pursue a body of work apart from the pressures of teaching, administrative life, and just to do it and to be protected, and then to bring those scholars together in a seminar. And for a long time, that was kind of the model that we pursued. And I want to acknowledge Kathy Woodward, a prior president, who played a kind of a key role as humanities centers were getting established with that kind of charge in mind of bringing them together and sort of asking how can they be professional, right? How can they become part of the professional life of the university? The second stage is what I think of as the stage of the lab. And that's where the model of humanities centers as spaces for collaborative work, project-driven, often publicly engaged with the emergence of the public humanities became a kind of a key articulation. And Stephen, I think this kind of goes to the cloistered versus engaged, or cloistered and engaged model. That was work that I would say characterized the efforts of the consortium through the mid-1990s into the early 2000s. And the consortium, which was US-based, began gradually to think about internationalizing. Predictably, the first phase of internationalization meant Western Europe, right? Engaging with scholars basically in Great Britain, France, Germany, to limited extent. But it was an important period as we began to kind of think beyond. The third stage is what I think of, so there's kind of study, lab, commons. And by commons, I mean thinking about the humanities as something that should be a property of the global commons of the work of the university and humanist and post-humanist inquiry within that work. More specifically, what that meant is that we began to understand how little we knew from within the US. We needed to provincialize our enterprise, and we needed to begin to meet with colleagues from around the world. And I credit Srinivasa Ravamudan. There'll be an honorary lecture in Srinivas's name tonight. And Srinivas was I think, just a kind of a revolutionary president for CHCI. He asked the board to begin to move out of the US, to have a series of meetings abroad, and then a series of international meetings in Australia, in Hong Kong, in Cape Town. Maritz van Donken helped organize that, culminating, not concluding, but as a fourth here in Santiago. What we began to understand from that perspective, and Stephen, this goes to a point that you have made, is that the form of the university-based and university-funded Humanities Center and Institute was in fact a highly provincial form. Important, significant, dominant in the US and North America, but not the global form. And so we began to think about how can we be a consortium not only of centers, but what we thought of as centering activities, right? Groups of artists, activists, scholars, students, non-governmental agents who found ways to be centering phenomena for an engaged humanities, who instituted the work of the humanities, and how could we sort of bring ourselves into partnership with them. And then the final stage is the one that I think of as the core. So study, lab, global commons, and core. And Ulka, I think this sort of goes to one of the points that you raised. By core, I mean how the humanities, both within the US, North America, Western Europe, East Asia, South Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, are increasingly embedded within a structure of university strategic planning, where in order to enter into the university's strategic plan, you need to make an argument that you're part of university infrastructure. And the way that you make an argument that you're part of university infrastructure is that you can establish that the Humanities Center, the work of the humanities, are a core analogous to the other cores that universities have, clinical trials units, right, in their schools of medicine and health centers, research computing and data analytics centers. And I think there's a pressure to say, as the universities articulate their purpose in relationship to solving global grand challenges, climate change, public health, artificial intelligence, that we are core to that. I'm going to end with saying I think that's really important work. I think we have to do it. I think that is true across universities, across the global north, global south, global east, global west. And I think it's insufficient. And Ulka, you said something about we need to think bigger. We talked about this at the board meeting recently. The global grand challenges paradigm is an engineering paradigm. It's an engaged paradigm, it's a thoughtful paradigm, but it's an engineering paradigm. I think that we have the opportunity to set a paradigm for universities that, and Erika, you raised this as well, that rather than beginning with the kind of the data-driven, we're not anti-data, but rather than driven with the quantifiable data-driven questions that engineering epistemologies bring to the university, to bring with normative value questions about justice and the possibility of freedom and openness in the future. My very last word, I was struck by the comments from the president of the university last night. When she greeted us, she said, in relationship to the pressing societal questions that all universities must engage, quote, the humanities have much to contribute and their contribution is urgent. Thanks to some thought that has been shared with me by Ranji Khanna and Ashila Mbembe, I've begun to think about what it might mean if the role of the humanities is less to address global grand challenges than to think about questions of global and planetary urgency, and what the difference is between the urgent and the challenge. So I'll end with that.
Yeah. Well, thanks. So Rosinka, how would you respond to the dilemma of the expert and the amateur?
So I was actually very pleased when you sent out this last-minute quote via email last evening, because it helped me to think about the role of criticism and the role of the Humanities Center in a larger, so if I might speak now in both from the point of view of India, as an Indian, and what's happening in that part of the world, and historically. So the first thing that I wanted to say is there are no humanities centers within universities anywhere in India. There is no such thing, as Ulka said, that doesn't mean that the work of the humanities is not done. Traditionally, it's been done in humanities departments in universities throughout India, and again, as Alka mentioned, in social science research institutes like ours. So there are 26 research institutes in the group that I belong to that are funded by the Indian Council of Social Science Research. But there is a core humanistic component to that. The social sciences are not divorced from humanistic work at all, in any sense of the term. What was interesting to me in thinking of the larger picture and historically was that Terry Eagleton was writing this in 1996, and the sentence is divided by a semicolon into these two halves. When he uses the word amateurism over there, and of course Ian mentioned amateur from the Latin lover friend, to do something for the love of it, I was thinking actually of the term elitism. Because in India, certainly, post-independence, throughout this period, the words bourgeois society point to that as well. There was this governmental and public response which thought of critical distancing or any work to do with reading, writing, literature, philosophy, aesthetics as elitist, and as something that need not concern a country that needed to build dams and bridges and invest in the STEM fields very early on, long before this particular turn. Then I was thinking, okay, 1996, and then in India liberalized in 1991. And the current government, so if we turn then from the historical, that trajectory to the current authoritarian government that we have in India now for the past 9 years almost. It began even before that, but it was strengthened with them. Neoliberal economics turns gladly towards this technological expertise that Eagleton is talking about. Technological expertise is all that matters. So that earlier function of critical distancing, which we're tending in our readings now to sort of divorce from the wider social relevance and all of that. I think, though, that work of critical distancing, that work of writing, reading, what were thought of as elitist pursuits, were and are now in danger, but were fundamental to the construction of the common. And it is the destruction of, the common good that this new neoliberal economics of Indian, reality. This is what is happening now, actually, in that when you turn as a society towards technological expertise, then you tend to lose some of that investment in critical distancing, in the humanities, in the work of the humanities, as reading, writing, and conveying something to do with being human, that is conveyed beyond and above and through also, definitely, programs of social justice and let's do something for, all of that cannot simply be implemented through programs and, setting agendas through our university departments or research priorities. It has to be done through that, yes, and that was always the case, but there is this wider social relevance that he's talking about that is lost. That was, in fact, I think, a function of critical distancing, a function of investing in the humanities as something that concerns all of us, that concerns a way of being human that has become bracketed with, was bracketed with elitism and with a distancing. So cloister was the word you used. So sort of a removal from, the street. But that was not always the case in India at all. The street was part of research agendas. The subaltern was part of research agendas for my center, certainly. You can think of the working class and work with the working class and do it through critical distancing and a focus on what was always thought of as being the core of the humanities, which is to convey some sense of wider social relevance through the word, the object, the text, and to somehow convey that to your students and through the work we do in our research centers and in humanities departments.
Thank you, Rosinka. That's a fascinating spin on the quote. Would either Erika or Ulka like to take a swing at the?
Since we're all having different readings of this text, I'll take a swing. What anchored me was this notion of expertise and who gets to be expert. And in my programming, I'm playing with multiple forms of expertise. In the spring semester next year, we'll have Robin Wall-Kimmerer, who has this beautiful book, Braiding Sweetgrass. She's an indigenous woman who's also a botanist, who I'm also going to label a humanist. But a lot of the text struggles through the kinds of knowledge that she possessed and knew about the natural world, and then encountering botany and science in the university space. So when we talk about expertise and whose knowledges and wisdoms get revered or even acknowledged or studied or understood, is what I read that's what came to me when I read this quote. The other piece is the role and function of criticism. I mean, we as humanists, we are to question, we are to critique, and for some audiences that's difficult to hear. But dissent in a democracy remains very important, so that's something else that occurred to me in this quote. But appreciating that some of the function of criticism is to enable us to construct something new. So given that we were invited to have a conversation about re-envisioning the Humanities Center for the 21st century, this needs to be an iterative process of understanding what knowledges are available to us, being open to encountering them and grappling with them and struggling with them, and interrogating ourselves as experts and expertise, and being willing to acknowledge that someone else may also have knowledge that we simply don't know, and need to be more conscious about recognizing the expertise of our community partners, recognizing ways that we can engage the experts who are our colleagues in conversation with these other bodies of knowledge. So,
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll take a follow-up kind of on the same expertise amateur question from another direction, completely agreeing with what you said about looking for expertise elsewhere. But I mean, are you thinking about the structure of this conference as compared to some of the other conferences that we go to, where we come with our expertise and we present it, and then we leave, and and each of us brings our expertise, which is what we do as academics. This is such a different kind of conversation because we're actually talking more as, dare I say it, generalists or people interested in larger humanities questions, but not, as a scholar of the Indian novel, I'm coming here and giving you so I find that something to consider when we think about what has been, I think, a negative association with the amateur compared to the expert within the university. And what kinds of knowledges do we bring? And that, I think, gets out of some of this, the sense we have that we are the experts and everyone outside is, lacking that expertise, and we can provide the expertise to them. So it, first of all, does what you say, Erika, opens up knowledge as coming from lots of different positions, not only the university, but I also think calls us to reconsider, what we're even doing in the university. I mean, we think about the question of graduate student, like the fact that we're training so many graduate students for very few jobs, and the old model is that we still train them in these very narrow categories of expertise. But what about if we think of training them as in a sense, again, of being a generalist, and this is a word that we really don't like within the university, but thinking about the bigger questions about the humanities, and I think that's where we can think bigger, because we can think about some of the work we do as actually bigger questions, rather than just in our specific fields and enterprises. And again, this is something that I'm a scholar of Indian literature and film within an English department in an American university. I've had to be a generalist in a sense, because most of the students are Victorian studies. I'm on committees of Victorian studies and American studies. I can never have been an expert, in this condition. But that's actually made me realize that some of the bigger questions are actually, I can talk about those bigger questions. It doesn't have to have this very expert knowledge. So I just think this is a great place to have that conversation, because we all do come together as humanists, but we're not engaging with each other only through our individual expertise, but across that. And I feel that's a generative way to maybe think outside Eagleton's binaries.
Thank you. That's very insightful. Thank you all for those responses and for doing your homework on the fly. So I believe, it's 1:45. We have about 15 minutes for questions and answer, Q&A. You raise your hand and we will bring the mic to you. You can pose a question to anyone on the panel. So I see a few people in the back of the room.
I'm David Shumway from Humanities Center at Carnegie Mellon. And although several of you have pointed in this direction, I just want to emphasize how deeply disabling this binary is for what we do. John Guillory has recently published a book which is basically based largely on assuming this binary. And in my reading of this book, what it basically tells us is that we can't use our expertise in ways that can be genuinely engaged. In other words, if we have to choose between these things, either we can give up our credentials and our work also in order to become engaged, or we can continue to do our work but forget the hope of actually doing anything in the world. And the point of that, I think, for Guillory is that he wants us out of the business of engagement as a traditional literary scholar. And of course, my view was just the opposite, that we, like scientists, can use our expertise in a transformational way, that we need both, and that the opposition is just, needs to be deconstructed and forgotten.
Sarah.
Hi, I'm Sarah Geyer, and I have a couple different thoughts. One of them is, I think one of the things that emerged here is just how local the approach is. So when I think, Ulka, about Brandeis, I think about the founding director or the initial director having a kind of came at it as an early modernist and someone who was doing a certain kind of work, and obviously you're trying to do a different work, but that's a very local set of conditions that then gets translated nationally or internationally or institutionally as we think about what is this institution of the Humanities Center. And when I think about Rosinka, so clearly is the work that you're describing a local opportunity that opens up broader questions. So I don't know that the very local origins of how, let's say you're thinking about institutions, is fully reflected. So that's kind of my first observation, is how do we reflect the local as we talk about humanities centers? And not just the local, like, I'm in a city, I'm rural, but like what is the history of and the origin of the Humanities Center from which you're emerging? And does that translate across other humanities centers? So that's kind of one initial observation I had. And then it also reflects what you just said at the end about who are we as Humanities Center directors or associate directors when we lead a center and when we come to these conversations? Do we come to them merely as administrators? Do we come to them merely as Humanities Center directors? Or no, as you just said, you're also a scholar. And in each of your presentations, you also could see that the reading you did, the questions you asked, reflect your local origins or your institutional origins as a scholar. And I think that's true over and over again. If you run a humanities center as a British romanticist or as a critical race theorist, really shapes what your approaches are. And so then the question that I would want to open up from that is, where are the humanities in this kind of new Mellon project? So I think we heard really compellingly about the interventions and about the ways of doing work, but I'm curious about, like, where is the reading, where is the, I can't remember how you said it, Rosinka, the reading, writing, the interpretation, the art, the film, like, where does that inflect the work that you're doing around questions of justice as different from historical forms of activism or other kinds of institutional work focused on questions of justice? What's the specific humanities wrinkle that you understand as part of this project?
Thank you for that question. Just the question of the local, I completely agree with you, but actually what's been really interesting about this conversation, and again, it's just been 10 center directors, so very kind of limited, is actually how much we have been able to talk across local contexts. So it certainly doesn't mean that every context is the same, but it's actually surprising how, and like we've had, and when we're talking about the US context, not only public-private access oriented, but also in red states and blue states, places where there are immediate issues about censorship that are very different from where I am in Massachusetts. So actually, it's been, I don't know what you think, Erika, but like it's been very fruitful to talk across these different contexts. And actually, I felt like we have found a lot of places of engagement. So I again, and not losing the specificity, you don't come back to your institution and say, this is a project we need to do, but I do see the value in these. And I think that your point, Rosinka, like, it's not just across the US. I mean, I think there are different contexts in what you're describing, but there's a lot where I can actually see similarities in the context. So yeah, I do have kind of hope for more of these conversations, that I do feel there's something valuable there. And then, yeah, the question of the humanities, that, is, as you said, kind of implied in your question, very much a part of what we bring anyway to the conversations. And I guess I think part of it, so the reading and the writing and the critical thinking, you mentioned critical distance. The critical distance is certainly there. I mean, the ability to analyze, different contexts and try to think about the futures. We're not trained very well. We are trained very well in reading and writing. We're not trained very well, at least I wasn't, in like planning and organizing and thinking about next steps and moving forward. And so that's for me, it's an add-on to humanistic thinking. It makes the humanistic thinking bigger and broader. But yeah, I mean, there's, but I guess where I will agree is that I have had to broaden my own sense of what counts as humanistic thinking. So just to give you a brief example, again, I mentioned that my expertise is in Indian literature, but being in a US context, in a US university, and thinking about what the conversations happening in the US are not actually conversations that are happening within Indian literature. They're much more about questions about, equity and inclusion in the US context based on historical realities of the US, and that has meant that what I do as a center director sometimes does live slightly at odds with what I do as a scholar. Because what I do as a scholar are much more questions that probably Rosinka Center deals with, which is questions about, justice in the Indian context. But that, for me, is not a loss, I guess, is what I'm saying. I think that, for me, is part of what it means to be a humanist, is to be able to think across contexts, to think differently than only what I was trained in, and to think broadly, and it doesn't even mean that I'm going to do scholarship on US questions now, but I feel like I do that in my praxis, in my work. So I see that what you're describing as an exciting challenge, not as a feeling that this isn't humanistic enough, if that answers your question. I don't know.
I can just jump in really quickly on that, Sarah, and also want to, by the way, in that turning of CHCI toward the global and the global commons, Sarah Geyer, who just stood up, if you don't know, is our immediate past president, has been a key figure in that. Sarah, just a little bit, maybe very briefly on the humanities in this. Say you think about kind of 3 moments in the humanities and take as an organizing framework the question of environmental change and climate, right? And how we think about 3 different iterations. Immediate predecessor to Terry Eagleton, Raymond Williams. You think about a book like The Country and the City, right? What would kind of characterize a humanistic approach to thinking about these questions? The reading and the theory, right? And for a long time, that was our work, the reading and the theory. I think what we've pivoted now into, in the kind of the engineering age, same kind of questions, is the solution and the data set, right? And work matters if it can solve and if it has a data set. I think one of the challenges for us now is how to think about not being beyond solution, not being beyond data set, not being beyond the quantifiable. That's the key to our work. But what are those aesthetic, affective dimensions? And the 2 that stand out just for me in part of what the humanities have to contribute, return to, in some ways, a version of your question of the local. Singularity, right? Singular forms of experience existence within global and planetary phenomena that humanistic disciplines, I think, have a particular capacity to bring to us beyond what the data set can deliver. And I think another is a certain cultivation, not only of an understanding of the nature of the dilemmas that are facing us and what we should do, but why we should desire to do so. And I think that one of the things that the humanities and humanistic work teaches us to do is they educate our desire, right? And they cultivate our desires. They teach us a passion. And so if I think about climate art, right, climate fiction, much of it is about desire through fear, right, desire through aversion of the apocalyptic, desire through kind of a sense of the retention of the possibility of sort of the dignified singular human life. And I do think that's kind of work for us to continue to hold on to, and one of the things that we bring that the other disciplines don't.
Hi, thanks very much to all the panelists. As you know, I'm Amanda Anderson, director of the Kogut Institute at Brown. So this a little bit follows on Sarah's question. I guess I would say that if the aspiration is to be essential infrastructure, and or a core, one has to think about that in relation to another imperative, which I would say is to symbolically and practically represent the full range of the humanities at the institution where you work. And in making a kind of very singular mission, you risk not doing that. And I think that, you know, one of the things that's really important, I mean, so Brown has this like incredible ecosystem of centers and institutes. And one of the first things in making kind of the humanities a core infrastructure element there was to make sure it became an institute when it started out as a center. And that involved certain kinds of building up of curriculum and initiatives. But I think you have to think in really ecumenical terms. I think that I have people doing initiatives at the Institute that are focused on social justice. I have people doing initiatives at the Institute that are not focused on social justice. They're focused on forms of aesthetic inquiry that various people coming to these initiatives have different value commitments, and they get expressed in different ways. But I also think just, you know, more, I mean, we have initiatives in environmental humanities, disability studies, the economies of aesthetics. You know, it's like, I think you need to sort of be very careful not to lose the humanities constituency at your university, which includes serious scholars who aren't necessarily going to enter into work on social justice. So I question this notion of a social justice imperative in this context, right? It's like, I think social justice work is crucial. I think there are many people who want to do it. I think the Humanities Center or Institute should be a home for it, but I think it has to be a home for much more. And if you want to be an essential infrastructure, you actually have to be, I think, at the leading edge of lots of different things going on in the university, including the strategic vision themes in public humanities, engaged scholarship, and then all of the complex expertise domains of the humanities. So that was more of a speech. Sorry. Please comment.
And I see.
We go to 11, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, I'll make this very brief since I have about 30 seconds. I'm Russ Castronovo, Director for the Center for the Humanities at UW-Madison. And I wanted to there's a lot to respond to here too, but I think what I most wanted to do was just to thank Ian for giving us this, as typically precise four-pronged rubric about how to think about the center. And I was curious too that you started with referencing Veronica Gago's speech from last night, who referenced Rosa Luxemburg. And I just want to go back to Luxemburg for a second to ask you about your sense of infrastructure, because it seems to me from Luxemburg through a whole chain of thinking, we get to the idea that, yes, you have to be transformative and work within an infrastructure, but then you also have to see beyond that existing structure. So when you're talking about the core, what I'm curious about is, do you see, and this is just for all of us, not just for Ian, but working within infrastructure, how does that transform what exists beyond the infrastructure, right? How does that transform, let's say if we're devoted to working within university infrastructure, how does that transform what necessarily lies outside of the university infrastructure? And so that would be an interesting place to kind of, engage with what you're saying about the centrality or not of social justice, because I do think that when we're thinking about infrastructure, we want to be curious in examining the space that we hold within infrastructure and our own devotions to it. And I know that you're a university provost, so that also may make this a complex question for you. But again, just to thank you too, because I think it's a really powerful rubric that you've given us to lay out and thinking about the history and the future of Humanities Center's roles with respect to the structures in which we find ourselves.
Thanks, Russ. I'm going to turn to Stephen to ask him whether I should give a brief answer or just take it offline, because
Give a brief answer.
Give a brief answer. Okay, so I will respond in the context of I am a university provost, and so maybe let me, to whatever extent that's helpful, right, thinking about the relationship between the two. So within my role as provost, I have responsibility for working with colleagues on establishing the university's research mission and establishing its research budget. And so we have thought about the university's research mission in two ways, infrastructure and grand challenges. We use that language, all right? And so the idea is if you advance the research, you've got to do two things simultaneously. You've got to lift the whole thing, right? Key infrastructure. So our university just went through a year-long process of strategic research infrastructure investments, right? Now, and so that's everything: research computing, postdocs, laboratory space, seed funding, office-sponsored programs, pre-award, post-award, right? The whole thing, government relations. What do you need to do? Establish a 10-year plan to lift the infrastructure. It was notable to me, we put together a university-wide committee, 80 faculty members. I'm an English professor. Our humanities colleagues had an incredibly difficult time finding themselves inside that conversation because infrastructure didn't make sense to them. I'm one of them, but this is my provost role, right? And we had to do things like, say, talk the same way that people in the School of Medicine are going to do about we need vivaria, right? We need clinical trials units. We need research computing, right? Make the argument. And so one is get in that argument and think big. Don't think in $50,000 or $100,000. Think in millions of dollars. Millions of dollars to play in that game, at least in that context, right, of the university budget. But what infrastructure does, part two of any, at least, global university, no matter how constrained their resources are, there's still money there. Infrastructure lifts the base, And then every university has a set of pillars of particular things they're doing. What has captured the imagination of university administrators to define the pillars is this grand challenge epistemology. Global grand challenges for societal impact. We do that, right? You lift the base, and then you find the grand challenge. So right now, what I would say is the immediate task of the humanities globally is get in the infrastructure debate and find your way in the grand challenges. Artificial intelligence, right? Can't do it without us. Climate change, can't do it without us. So but the grand challenge paradigm is running to its end. And I think the experiences of the past several years, globally, economic disruptions, right? The commons and commotion, right? Reorganization of work, public health paradox, rise of populisms. I think most university leaders understand that there is a return to the problem of the future state of the human, and for some administrators, the future state of the planet. And we honestly have a chance in this next phase, play in that game, get in the infrastructure debate, get in the grand challenges, but then say we have something else. And just to return to you, we have normative value propositions that the university is the custodian of the fate of the human condition. Sorry, I'll just end with this. In 2007, in the US, I mentioned this at the board meeting yesterday, the American Academy of Engineers convened about 20 world experts in engineering to establish a program for the future of engineering, and they came up with the grand challenges paradigm. That has dominated world university strategic thinking for the last 15 years. I would say this group of people is the leading organization and consortium of leaders of the humanities around the world. And I think that we honestly have an opportunity as a body to try to do something similar. And then these questions of, it's not a $5,000 investment, it's the future of the university, regardless of what your budget is. I really think that we have a chance to play in that game. Yeah.
Thank you to the panelists. Thank you for your questions. We have a break now for coffee. Yes. Okay. Coffee outside.